Welcome back, everyone. Really glad you're here today because this one is different. Bitcoin is at 66K as I'm recording this. Fear and greed is at 12, still extreme fear. Price is still below the 200-week EMA. On the surface, nothing has changed, but something just changed, something big. A few hours ago, Trump addressed the nation on the Iran war, and what he said, if it plays out, flips the entire macro script that has been weighing on Bitcoin for the last 2 months. Tonight, I want to walk you through exactly what he said, what it means for oil, inflation, and the Fed, what the SpaceX IPO story means for liquidity, and why the US Treasury latest move is quietly building the rails for the next wave of crypto adoption. By the end of this video, you will understand why I think the next 2 or 3 weeks could be one of the most important windows for Bitcoin in all of 2026. So now let's get into it. And the SpaceX angle, which almost nobody is connecting to Bitcoin right now, is the one I want you to pay closest attention to. I will get there, by the way. Now, quick chart check first because the structure matters more before anything else. Price is still below the 200-week EMA at 68K. That's the honest picture. Until we get a weekly close back above that line, the chart structure stays cautious. The RSI is deeply oversold. We're still in territory that historically only shows up at the generational buying zones. The MVRVZ scores remains around the 0.39 level we discussed in the last video, sitting in the same range as the 2018 bottom, COVID crash, and the FTX collapse. The on-chain picture has not changed, the setup is still there. The single level that changes everything on this chart, 68K. Weekly close above it, the base case is alive, and we're looking at 72K and then 84K. Weekly close fails, 60 to 63K comes into play. Now let me tell you why the next 2 to 3 weeks could be the catalyst that finally puts us back above that line. Because what Trump said tonight isn't just political noise, it has a direct and specific impact on oil, inflation, and the Fed. And I want to show you exactly how that chain reaction works for Bitcoin. Quick one from me, I partnered with BitUnix and we've got a live event right now. New users earn up to 40 USDT in future bonuses. Deposit 100, get up to 20 USDT. Complete your first futures trade, get another 20. If you've been thinking about getting started, link is in the description, by the way. Here's the story. Tonight, Trump addressed the nation on the Iran war, which has been the single biggest macro overhang on Bitcoin since February. He said the US is very close to completing all military objectives. He put a timeline on it, 2 to 3 weeks, and then he said something that I want you to really hear. He said when this conflict ends, the Strait of Hormuz opens naturally. Iran will want to sell oil to rebuild, oil prices come back down, and stock prices rapidly go back up. Now, I'm not here to tell you Trump's timeline is guaranteed or that the war ends on schedule. War doesn't work like press conferences, but here's what matters for Bitcoin that market has been pricing in uncertainty about this war for months. The moment there's a credible signal that the end is near, the uncertainty premium starts to unwind, and when it does, three things happen in sequence. First, oil drops. Oil has been above $100 a barrel, sitting around $103 right now after spiking on tonight's speech. When the Strait of Hormuz reopens, oil supply floods back into the market, prices normalize, energy costs fall. Second, inflation cools. Oil is one of the biggest drivers of persistent inflation. When oil comes off, CPI follows, and when CPI falls, the Fed's hands are untied. Third, the Fed can cut. Rate cuts are the single most powerful tailwind for risk assets, including Bitcoin. The entire bull case for the second half of 2026 has been waiting for this exact chain reaction. Bitcoin fell 2% during Trump's speech as oil initially spiked. That's the short-term noise. The medium-term signal is that the President of the United States just put a 2 to 3 week timeline on the end of the single biggest macro headwind this market has faced all year. Here's the part that surprised me most when I dug into today's news, because SpaceX just filed for the largest IPO in history, and they're sitting on over 565 million worth of Bitcoin. Now, let's talk about SpaceX because this connects to Bitcoin in two ways that most people aren't discussing. Elon Musk's SpaceX filed confidentially for an IPO this week. The potential valuation is $1.75 trillion, and to put that in context, that's larger than Meta, larger than Tesla, and larger than Bitcoin's entire market cap. They could raise up to $75 billion from the offering, more than double the largest IPO in history, expected to launch as early as June. Here's the first Bitcoin connection. SpaceX SpaceX already holds 8,285 Bitcoin on its balance sheet, worth over $565 million right now. When SpaceX goes public at $1.75 trillion, that Bitcoin treasury gets disclosed to millions of new public investors. Every fund manager, every retail investor, every pension that buys SpaceX shares will now indirectly hold Bitcoin. That's a normalization signal you can't manufacture. The second connection is liquidity. A $75 billion IPO of this scale pulls a capital from across the market in the short term. That's actually a headwind for everything, including Bitcoin, in the weeks around the listing. But once the capital is deployed and risk appetite is confirmed, it tends to flow into everything. Watch June closely. And then there's the regulatory story, which is quieter but just as important for the long game. The US Treasury is now formally building out the implementation framework for the Genius Act, the stablecoin law Trump signed last year. They're setting the rules: one-to-one reserve backing, monthly reporting, full AML compliance. The stablecoin market is approaching $300 billion in total value. What this means for Bitcoin is simple. Every dollar of regulated stablecoin infrastructure makes it easier, safer, and more familiar for institutions to move capital into digital assets. The rails are being built right now in real time while the price is down. So let me bring this all together, because the chart, the war timeline, the SpaceX IPO, and the regulatory picture are all pointing at the same window, and I want to show you what I'm doing about it. Also, the BitUnix deposit event is live. Deposit 100 USDT, hold 3 days, get a 100 USDT position voucher. Tiers go up to 2000 USDT for bigger rewards. Slots are limited, link is in the description. Now, let me be straight with you about where I stand. Bitcoin is at 66k, below the 200-week EMA. Fear and greed at 12. On paper, still ugly. But a macro script just shifted tonight in a way that hasn't happened since the war started. Trump put a timeline on the end of the single biggest headwind in this market has faced all year. SpaceX just filled the largest IPO in history with 8,285 Bitcoin on its balance sheet. The US Treasury is building stablecoin infrastructure in real time, and the NVRV Z-score is sitting at levels only ever seen at the deepest bottoms in Bitcoin's history. I'm not going all in, I want to be clear about that. The war isn't over yet. Trump's timeline could slip. Oil is still elevated. The Fed hasn't moved. These are real risks, and I'm not pretending they're gone. But here's my honest opinion. I've been adding small stage entries at the 65k to 68k range, and I have dry powder at 60 to 63k if the breakdown deepens. If we get a weekly close back above 68k, especially on the back of war de-escalation news, I'm adding meaningfully. My best entries have always come when the narrative was the worst and the data was quietly turning. March 2020, November 2022, both felt impossible, both were right. I'm not saying 66k is the exact bottom, but I'm saying with a 2 or 3 week war timeline now public, a 1.75 trillion IPO holding Bitcoin coming to the market, and the regulatory framework for crypto getting built out by the US Treasury, the setup is different today than it was yesterday. Base case, war ends on or near Trump's timeline, oil drops, inflation cools, Bitcoin reclaims 68k, grinds towards 72k, then the 200-day EMA at 84k. Risk case, war drags on, oil stays elevated, 68k continues to fail, 60 to 63k becomes the conversation. Draw powder ready. The level, 68k, weekly close above it, the narrative changes overnight. We're watching this day by day. The next 2 to 3 weeks could be the most important window of 2026 for Bitcoin, so stay close. Let me know what you're seeing in the comments, and thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you in the next one.